Hey, it's me, Bini. What wonderful weather we're having today. I know for all you folk up in the States, things are starting to freeze over, but over here in the Down Under, things are just heating up. And what better way to spend some time in the sun than by cruising around the ocean? It's a nice day, but man, this salty air is drying me up. Let's head inside. And let's go for a dive, shall we? After all, the coolest stuff is under the surface. Obviously, we're not just here to see the sights though. We're here to do what we always do. Model. The ocean's deep and dark and full of all kinds of life. You've got your sharks, dolphins, jellyfish, solid fish, and they're all pretty cool. But there's always been tales of something more. Something bigger. Fishermen of old traded tales of large sea beasts like the kraken, a giant octopus/squid that was capable of taking down ships. Or even modern-day urban legends, like people who say the giant prehistoric megalodon shark still roams our waters. Nowadays, the kraken's been reduced to its real-life counterpart in the form of the deep-sea giant squid, and the megalodon's been reduced to the Meg, and the Meg to the trench. But people still have the itch for giant sea monsters, even if they're just fictional. Subnautica comes to mind, an underwater survival game chock-filled with original alien marine life. And there's all kinds of great designs, but the spotlight always falls on the Leviathan class organisms. Giant creatures that populate the deepest seas of Subnautica, usually predatory and hostile in demeanor. But what if there was more? What if we could make more? You already know where I'm going with this. Today, we're designing a sea monster.
Warning. Creating life of such size may become a major disruption for the local ecosystem.
Alright, let's make it 2. Yeah, 2 sea monsters. And then they can scrap it out and they'll basically cancel each other out. Yeah, that sounds like a safer option. While there are more alien designs out there, I think it best if our sea beasts align with some pre-existing body types. So let's get some options together. Submarine! Scan the surrounding area for genetic material.
Scanning radius. Six suitable phenotypes have been detected. Uploading them to your workbench now.
Haha, sweet. Let's see what we're working with here. We've got whales and other porpoises. I think mostly the whale part jumps out though, since dolphins aren't exactly the picture of a sea monster, which is kind of ironic if you actually hear about what some of the antics dolphins get up to. The only whale-like monsters I can think of off the dome are probably either Herman Melville's Moby Dick, a story about a giant aggressive albino whale, or the bloop, which was a hypothetical creature based off of a loud underwater noise that was theorized to belong to an animal larger than any known to science. Said science then proceeded to debunk it as an ice quake, but the bloop creature itself is usually depicted with this image, which I'd say is fairly whale-like. Let's see what else we've got here. Eels and other serpents. You don't see as many depictions of these nowadays, but sea serpents have been a concept for probably as long as seafaring has been around. You see it in old ocean maps, and the first serpent that comes to mind for me is actually SCP-3000. Kind of specific, I know, but SCP-3000 is a giant serpent, described as strongly resembling a moray eel, capable of psychic influence and secreting a black substance that can wipe your memory. Sharks. Probably one of the more classic sea monster types since the release of Jaws in 1975. Despite their attack statistics not actually being that high, a lot of people still fear these creatures and consider them pretty monstrous as is. You've also got the Megalodon that I mentioned earlier, which gained a lot of public attention sometime in the 2000s and earned a special place for me as a kid who would watch Windows Movie Maker Megalodon sighting, in brackets, real tribute videos full of obviously fake images to the tune of Down with the Sickness. Moving on. Cephalopods. That encompasses squids and octopi. Octopuses? Octopodes. The most obvious monster in this category is the kraken. Admittedly, the octopus is my favorite animal, and the kraken probably sits up as one of my favorite mythical monsters. But the giant octopus trope is a little bit played out, and I'm not entirely sure I can get as much variation out of a design. Let's see. Generic fish body. Meh. Crustaceans! These are crabs and lobsters, crayfish and shrimp. I'm not entirely sure what the general consensus is on these creatures, but I personally find these guys super cool. They're like bugs, but in the water. What's not to love? That being said, as an Australian, I've gotta say, bugs are neat, but they're also creepy as hell, and I'd feel much better if they were fictional. Nonetheless, the creature in this category that comes to mind is the Thanapod from the Love, Death and Robots episode Bad Traveling. A giant ocean crab capable of understanding language and speaking through corpses. Creepy, but awesome. So, what'll we go with? I know everyone will have their own pick for what pairing they'd want to see, but personally, I'm drifting towards these two. The shark and the crustacean.
But you said octopodes were played out. A shark's not like the most overdone.
Yeah, maybe, but all those legs, I mean, it'd be hard to do.
You literally picked crustacean as your option 2.
Yeah, but just let me cook.
But
Quiet, Submarine.
okay.
This seems as good a place as any. A big blue expanse. Shouldn't be interrupted here. It's also a fairly tropical area, not too deep. The perfect environment for sharks. And, you know, crabs too. Alright, let's press some buttons right here.
Projecting workbench scene.
Oh yeah, I can get some work done here. Now, creating something as massive and detailed as a giant sea monster starts way before the 3D modeling process even begins. There's planning your timeline, organizing ideas, and visualizing your final design. But thankfully, we have today's sponsor for this video, Milanote. Milanote is an online tool used for organizing ideas and planning out creative projects, and that's what we're doing here for our Leviathans. We're given a huge canvas to work on and all kinds of tools to let us plan out and brainstorm on ideas. Not to mention there's collaboration features so multiple people can work on a Milanote project. I've actually used Milanote in the past for this exact thing, except instead of sea monsters we were designing a short indie game for a game jam project. Now I'm using it here for these sea monster designs, and having options like subboards and being able to copy paste pictures right onto the canvas makes it super convenient to use on the fly. Milanote also has a web clipper extension that's free and lets you save images and text directly to your boards from any website. It's perfect for creatives like us, since a lot of us are visual people, and the amount of customization means you can tweak it to look and feel right for you. We've got these subboards here for each sea creature we're doing, one for the shark and one for the crustacean respectively, not to mention this design plan board is a subboard in and of itself. It's great for managing everything without getting a bunch of clutter everywhere, and I can add notes, tasks, images, videos, and a bunch of other stuff all on here. It's really easy to start up a project on Milanote. There's over 100 hot and ready templates for any creative project you'd need. For example, I started off with the mood board template when I started gathering all my inspiration and quickly got used to the interface until I was able to organize everything for my project. And no matter what it is you're working on, Milanote's incredibly adaptable to your needs. When you want to share your work, you can also invite others for some feedback and collaborate with them in real time. Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so sign up for a free Milanote account using the link in the description. Thank you to Milanote for supporting this video. Now let's get back into it. Like I said, I'm a visual guy. We're hopping right into the modeling here. I've got all kinds of inspiration ready to look at, and it's time we get into creation. We're starting with the shark here. Obviously this is going to be a monster shark, so we're going to give it some unique, fantastical features. But first things first, let's pick out a body type to base ourselves on. I want the shark to be fairly angular, sleek but ready to strike. It's in contrast to many crustaceans having somewhat rounder builds, save the pinchy parts, and I want the two to have opposing shape language. The mako shark stands out to me as a good candidate. It's long and pointy and hella hydrodynamic. That means it's real fast in the water, plus I just like how they look. They're one of those sharks that really strikes me as a fighter. Meanwhile, you've got ones like the wobbegong shark that always just look kinda sad. I also just found out through the power of autocorrect that it is in fact pronounced wobbegong and not wobblegong, as I've been led to believe for my entire life up to this exact moment. The only thing I'd change up to this general body shape is that it doesn't quite pack enough mass, but bull sharks have these big humps on their back that give me grizzly bear vibes. Like there's a lot more muscle packed into this thing. So we're incorporating that into the design. I'm going to be working off of my base concepts and work on the design on the fly. So while I have some ideas, we're going to start off by just getting a base shape out there. To do that, we can block out the shape using a type of geometry called a metaball. These are volumes of shapes that can merge and form with one another, allowing us to lump pieces together into a conceivable shape. For our shark, we're going to use a lot of oblong spheres, and use them to define the main center of the body, the tail, as well as two protrusions at the front that make up the head and jaw respectively. The fins of this shark are done with cubic metaballs, flattened down into the somewhat angular shape of a shark fin. Our first dip into the more anomalous features are a second set of fins and a smaller extra dorsal fin. It's simple, but an easy way to give the design a bit more interest while also putting definition on the model's silhouette. With the basic shapes done, we can make a few adjustments to the positioning of individual metaballs to reconfigure the proportions of our shark. From there, the basic form is in place and the shark's blockout is now ready for digital sculpting. And now that our shark's base is done, it's time for the crustacean! That's right, instead of doing the full process back to back, we're doing both sea monsters simultaneously. So let's waste no time jumping into it. We're starting our process not with metaballs like the shark, but with normal polygon cubes. I want the body shape of this creature to be somewhere between a lobster and a crawdad, since I think the longer body type lends itself better to mobility. We're creating the length of the body, with the main thorax area being much bulkier than the tail, which has a smaller, thinner paddle at the back that'll make up the tail fins. On the sides, we're using the same cubes, creating 5 on each side and pulling them into a hard angle so they have a sort of L shape. I honestly didn't like how they looked, and maybe they could have used better angling, but we'll remake these later with a slightly different setup. We'll delete the frontmost 2 legs and instead angle them a bit forward, since these will be the base for our crustacean's claws. We're pulling these out and creating a C shape at the end with some slight points to it, and for now, that's our claws. I decided to turn the tail into its own separate object since crustaceans are generally very segmented in their bodies, and this won't be the last time we do this, but for now we're proceeding with the first iteration of this blockout. We'll pull in the claws a bit closer and create some large protrusions on the top of the head to create lobster antennae. As it stands, these are pulled back in a boomerang shape, and we'll also throw in some mandibles at the front, though these won't last. Looking over the design, I'd like to say that it's ready to go, but in practice it just doesn't read how I want it to, so we're going back in to change up the structure a bit more. That includes making the tail much longer and doing away with our current setup of legs. Instead of long spidery crab legs, this crustacean is intended to be able to maneuver itself through the water. So instead, we're using a bunch of smaller smooth cubes to create the structures that make up the legs, which this time around are more shrimp-like and curved back. The claws will get pulled forward once more and the head will get separated into its own separate object. The tail is also its own object, and a series of thin plates will be placed along the tail and thorax to create some basic shelling. The antenna at the top will get removed for now, and we'll create some new ones in time. The tail fins are also going to get some separation, this time into separate tail flaps, since this is how it is on existing finned crustaceans. The bottom pincher of the claw is also separated out, and the mandibles will be pulled out in favor of turning them into a new set of antennae. These ones being more forward facing and somewhat closer to what lobsters actually have, curving slightly back towards the body. Some slight positioning adjustments are in order, and we'll create a small hole on the head object where the eyes will go. From here our crustacean is ready for the sculpting process. In due time we'll see. Let's check in on our shark. Same as we left it! We're in the sculpting phase here, and while we could only change the shapes of the shark before as per each placed metaball, now we're getting into digital sculpting and we can make more minute adjustments to the forms of our model. This is initially just sharpening out the fins and smoothing off any unwanted lumps as a result of hard angle changes between metaball objects. Now it's time to place in some of the more anatomical details, beginning with the shark's head. The aim is to get the head looking sufficiently shark-like, and to do that we're adding mass along the jowls next to the mouth, which itself will also have some mass removed to create the mouth hole. We're also adding around the edges of the mouth to square it off better, as well as defining the tip of the shark's snout to a finer point. From here we can start working up to the neck area, or whatever sharks have, and lining the musculature up the back with some slightly fattier padding down the underside. With a better look at our shark, we can start looking at the silhouette as a whole and realign the proportioning to look a little bit better. And now we can add in the eyes, 2 simple spheres. Around them we'll sculpt a slight rim surrounded by some depth to create the eye sockets. We'll add in some muscle on the back and the sides, which we can lead down into the fins to define the connecting tissue and add in some more of that slightly padded mass on the shark's underbelly. We can also add some streaks down the fins, though admittedly this probably doesn't help much. Returning to our shark head, we're adding more of the details. After adding some more padding to the jowls, we'll move up to the top of the snout to draw in some lines for the nostrils and a rim around the top edge of the head where the shark's head flattens out and the colours change. While we're up here, we'll also add some density to the top and above the eyes to create skull definition. We'll go back to the mouth to clean it out a bit more and pull in some of the shapes, since we've mostly been working on a side profile which can result in some differences when you flip to a different angle. The tail needs some quick defining before we can go ahead and smooth over everything. We haven't gone too detailed yet, so we can afford to lose some details this way in favour of having a less blocky looking sculpt later down the line. Seeing the model like this, I intend to smooth the muscling on the back way more to better resemble a real world shark, but the way the shapes are built on the back gives me a vibe, a monstery vibe, like its skin is laid on tight over thick muscle. With a new smooth-ish shark, we'll once again fix up our shapes. Have you heard of sawfish? They're like sharks, but with huge saws mounted on their snouts. They're actually a type of ray, but it's close enough that I want to pull some inspiration here. After all, if we're putting these critters to war, we ought to give them a weapon. If you're still not convinced, here's the knife head kaiju from Pacific Rim. So, naturally, we'll pull out the snout to get a trial run of the idea. The snout kinda makes me realize just how stubby the head of the shark is, and to compensate we'll pull out the head a bit further and slope out the back a bit more for a longer shark. I think it looks good enough that we'll leave it here for now and work elsewhere while we think. We're adding slight divots behind each fin to give it more shape variance and drawing in some lines around the sockets of the fins to define them better. With enough of the groundwork laid out, it's safe enough to start creating some teeth in the mouth of the shark we've made so far. To do so, I'm using a standard cube as a base and applying various effects known as modifiers. Of these modifiers are a modifier for symmetry and one for increasing the amount of faces while smoothing out the object. Using these, we can create a set of basic gums by creating a C shape over the top layer of the mouth and adding in a bunch of smaller, longer shapes to act as the teeth. With these shapes in place, I can also apply a modifier that gnarls and twists them, giving them a more natural and frankly creepy look. Throwing them into our sculpting setup, we can sculpt onto the gums around the tops of the teeth to create the bumps where the roots of the teeth enter the gums. From there, we can do some more touch-ups on the body, thinning out some of the fins a bit more, and then taking ourselves to the side of the body to implement some gills. To do so, we're gonna mask off the area and then mask in some lines where the gills would be, pulling the sculpt to fold over those masks, creating believable layered height to make up the gills. In the same vein as the divots placed on the fins, we'll also add some points to better define the silhouette and just make them look a little bit more interesting. To define some of the features a bit better, we'll use a line-based brush to create more of a divider between the muscles that make up the sides of the back, as well as creating some height lines around the edges of important shapes so the angle changes are more noticeable. And that just goes around the muscle form of the jowl, the top of the head, and down the back to the tail. We'll also add some paint to the sculpt, though this is only for visualization's sake, and we won't get this going into the texturing process. It's gotten to about that time, when we start adding in the finer details. To start us off, we're drawing in the wrinkling above the mouth under the nose saw, sort of like the shark equivalent of the philtrum, which is that spot between your nose and mouth. We can work our way up to the face, where we can add some surrounding tissue to the nostrils and create the facial lines leading under the eye and up to the back of the neck. We'll also add some more mass onto the gills to make them look more realistically like flaps of flesh rather than just some lines in the side, and also add some underneath around the underside of the neck area and down to the underbelly. For sharks, their muscle structure is actually fairly evenly distributed, with a good portion of the body's musculature following the same grain along the length of the body up to the head. So we're drawing those in, adding some consistent lines across the side of the body, both to give some surface detail but also to define the shark muscles under the skin. Remember how we pulled out the snout for a sawfish nose earlier? Now we're going to properly define it. It's a similar process to the teeth, except instead of downward points, these are pointing out to the side. Implementing them in our sculpt means we'll draw in some rims around each spike of the saw, making them appear as if they're rooted into the snout, and then add a heightened line from the tip of the saw down the back, defining the top layer a little bit. We'll add in a line under the jowls to make them more visible and draw in some bumps along the bottom jaw, considering there's only a top gum visible, so these teeth are pretty heavily rooted into the bottom jaw, and these bumps are here to prove it. I added some lines onto the side fins for some kind of extra definition, but admittedly I'm not too happy with it, so it'll see a retouch later. But for now, we can go after something different. Considering this is a monster shark, I think it fitting if we add in a second set of eyes. Personally, for the same reason as the double fins, because I think it's cool, but also because it'd be consistent with the double fins from a design standpoint. Just like the first eye, we're using simple spheres and drawing in around the edges, and especially the underside where the skin droops down a bit. I'll take this chance to get some more work done in the area, touching up around the other eye and the nostril before moving on to the underside of the snout. The underside of these sawtooth snouts, at least in skeletal form, have these dips in between where the saw teeth fit through. So naturally we're going to draw some onto the underside of our shark snout to simulate the same effect. We'll draw another line up the back, this time in the center, and then go back to the head area, specifically the jaw, since the strongest muscle in the jaw is generally the one on the side at the base of the jaw, and here we're going over that to give it more size. We're just going over the facial area and defining more details here, like cordoning off the wrinkling above the mouth from the nose with a folding line and fixing up some of the shapes a bit more. It's here that I considered adding some whiskers, kinda like catfish ones, and while that was the initial idea, I'll develop these into something else later. For now, I'm going along the same route of adding extra length going up the back and adding in some rigid plates for that threat factor. We'll also define the edges around the head area and under the eyes some more, but namely we're creating this seam along the back of the head. In the interest of creating some more surface variety, we're also going to mark these lines along the side and draw in some mass on top of it. Not where the gills are, but the muscle group above it. These lines go along the muscle grain, so it shouldn't look too out of place, besides the obvious fact that sharks don't really have muscle definition like this. The fin will get one new bump in it, because I think it deserves one, and with bumps on the mind, we'll go ahead and add some spikes along the underside of the jaw to complement the ones on the back, which will also get some smaller spikes in between the larger plates, and then adding a line running down their length to give them a more sharp, diamond-like point, and a pinching brush to do the same. Once again, more divots in the fins, and a little bit of shape adjustment to them in general. It's here that we'll go back to the head, and struck with a bit of inspiration, I realized that what was once meant to be whiskers on the head actually read visually like one of those spiked conch shells, or at least some variation of seashell. Either way, I decided to run with the idea, and added in some more spikes. The concept here is that our shark has a sort of shell-like hard plating covering its head, sorta like a helmet, which takes a shape akin to a seashell. Good for offense and defense. While we're here, we'll make some definition in the face in places around the eyes and the nose, with the eyes getting a sharper rim to them and more defined lines at the edges, which look somewhat akin to eyelids despite the fact sharks actually have sideways facing eyelids, but nonetheless we're adding it in, however subtle. We'll also do another one over on the snout wrinkles and then move up to the back where we'll draw a tall line along the center back. This will result in some ridges, which we can pull down and adjust to create a set of secondary fins along the shark's back. Unlike the dorsal fins though, these are more like classic spiked fish fins, thinner and more webbed. Flipping the shark over, we'll add in some spikes to the underbelly of the beast and draw a line along the belly to create the seam where the muscles and padding meet. We'll also add in some lines leading into the fins and sculpt in between them to create some connecting folds and bumps. I also want to get a rework done on the shark teeth, and by rework I mean remake. We're going back to the model for the teeth and creating some new ones that are slightly less spindly and distributing them more haphazardly, with some coming out higher up in the gums. This helps it have more of a natural and scary look without having to twist and turn our teeth too much. Adding those new teeth in, we can readjust the bottom jaw to fit over them better and fix up some shapes. It's now that we're gonna switch gears. From this point, we've been creating the visual detail that defines the shark structure, but now I'd say we've done enough here to move on to the finest detail pass of them all. We're changing the shape of our brush from a circle to a texture of many small dots, which can emulate the appearance of rough skin surfaces. For now, we're just putting it on the snout area, but we'll get back to this soon. Next part of this process is drawing in some cracking and scratches around the mouth area, where the shark would have taken in struggling prey, resulting in the damage we'd see in the area. We'll also define the snout wrinkling once again, and lead those lines into the face. It's here that I'll use said lines to cordon off the faceplate from the rest of the body, making it look more like a separate piece of armor. We'll draw in some more details around the nostrils and eyes before pulling the snout wrinkling down a bit. I also thought the nose saw was a little bit too upturned, so I decided to aim it a bit more down and lock in on the faceplating idea, starting with some more line placements in areas where the plates would be segmented. Some more ridging to the brow is in order, and the next move on the docket is to pull in the mouth more. We already have the hole, sure, but mouths go down into the body. I'm not going that far, mind you, but at least pulling it in a bit more so it's less noticeably solid, as well as drawing in some of the mouth ridges and folding within. Just like how we used the brush with small dots for roughness, we're using it again, but this time with a brush that has a bunch of lines. This follows the angle of the brush, and we can use it to give the body a little more grain and appear just a little bit less smooth and more imperfect. This is just going along the grain of the muscles again, plus anywhere else it seems necessary, like the small fish fins lining the top. We're also using a brush with some more scraggly lines and only hitting a few places on the body, since these are to give the appearance of surface level damage, things like scratches and bites. Going back to the helmet plating, we're adding in some more spikes without any symmetry, the uneven distribution laying more credence to the naturality of it and the erratic build-up that a hard plate like this would develop. Doubling down on that idea is the addition of some more surface detail brushing, this time with a cracked, almost rock-like brush. This goes over the hard plates and sells the idea that these are bone or some kind of hardened cartilage, and that just goes over the whole plated area of the head. We're also adding some detail streaks to the teeth, nothing too crazy but enough that it'll make them a little less perfect. Looking around here, I also realized that I forgot to make a tongue, or the shark equivalent, which is basically like a tongue but not as mobile and a bit more flat. Nonetheless, adding in a simple sphere and stretching it out to the floor of the mouth gives us the perfect base to sculpt in a simple tongue object. It's now that our shark sculpt looks pretty good. I'm sure with more time we could have iterated on it a little bit more, but I'm pleased with the design, and I think it's safe to move on. Now we're facing the crustacean. Just like the shark, we're able to now make more specific adjustments to the shape of our monster. Right away, this big shell on the back is just a smooth plate, so we're going to start drawing on some loose mass in that area. Nothing too specific yet, but something to act as our jumping off point. Since crustaceans and especially lobsters are absolutely chock-filled with spikes, we're adding some around the bottom edge of the back plate. The design of this crustacean is generally meant to be rounder than the shark's design, but these spikes shouldn't mess with that too much, plus it'd look a bit lackluster without them. On the underside, we're sculpting in some of the connecting flesh that leads from the bottom into the legs, giving them more of a supporting structure. We can also draw into the middle, creating some more bumps that'll become the segmented plates of the undershell. To create said segmentation, we'll use the damn standard brush to create deep lines around the edges of any part of the model that should be segmented. We'll draw in a line on the back plate that separates its front and back, and also draw around those undershell structures we just did, accentuating their shape and creating the plating. We'll also draw some lines down the tail to separate them into their respective segments, lining up with the placement of the shell plates on the top of the tail and sculpting some mass in between them to give them a little bit more density. Going to the head, we'll add in some more bumps and shapes along the top, following some image reference of real-world crustaceans on the way the shell would warp. We'll also want to separate this off into the harder overshell and the smoother undershell. To do that, we'll create a mask layer over the bottom half of the shell so that we can work on the top half without any trouble. Using this, we'll add in a bunch of small spiked ridges along the edge and a little bit on the front. Now we can invert the mask so we can have access to the bottom half of the head, and using some more lines, we can draw in edges along places that fit our reference for shell plate placement, with these plates being flatter and generally smoother. 2 simple spheres can fit into the eye holes we made during blockout, and we'll move on to the claws. The upper arm of the claw will get a little bit more girth than the rest since it's the point that holds the weight of the claw and is likely pretty dense. We'll also add some spiking to the edge of that area and also bulk up the forearm without it overtaking the upper arm, giving it the same spiked treatment down into the claws. The claws have some meat to them, namely in the parts just behind the pinches themselves where the muscle would need to hold up and control the grip of the claws. Inside the claws, we're adding some more spiking where it can actually pinch and tear at stuff, and once that's done, we can make some adjustments to the overall shape of the claws. To put a bow on it, we'll draw some rims around the sockets where the claws and also the legs connect into the body. That way it looks more like it's rooted into the body rather than just glued on. Moving back to the back plate, we'll add some more spikes up its length around the back of the head. The legs need some detail too, and however subtle, we're drawing some simple surface grain into its surface. After that, just like everything else, these legs will get some spikes on the edge of each leg segment. We're also changing up our brush here, changing from the circular one to one with a bunch of little dots. However, unlike the brush we used for some of the rough shark detailing, these dots are a little bigger and intended to be here as bumpiness on the shell rather than skin detail. We're only sculpting onto one of the legs for this process since there just isn't any point in doing it multiple times and we can just duplicate the same leg after the fact. We're moving back to the claw, our newfound bumpiness brush on a mission. I can't tell if this is cheap detail, but frankly it keeps looking pretty good, so we'll go over the claws with the same treatment, creating bumpiness along its surface, namely in places away from other details where there are larger stretches of bare shell, and we'll vary these by having larger bumps and then smaller bumps near the edges where the larger bumps fade out. Same process goes for the head and back, and we're bumping up all over the place. The line on the back also gets defined a little here, and the edge rims also get sharpened out a bit more. Nothing too crazy. Back at the head, we'll also sharpen some edges out here, as well as creating some more seam lines on our undershell. These are lines leading down from the main antenna to the underside of the body, and they help create some flow between them. I think with enough of the back drawn, it's finally time to define the segmentation there too. It's not entirely the same as the segmenting on other parts of the body, since the back shell play is still all mostly a singular piece, but crustaceans, and admittedly more so crabs than lobsters, have lines and seams down their back where the plating itself fused during development. These aren't as harshly defined as the ones we're making here, but the name of the game is strong shape definition, so we're making these ones a lot harder than they normally would be. We're also adding some edges around the side spikes, not quite segmentation but more like depth. We can lead these forms on the back up and over the head where we'll follow the same process, drawing in bumps and forms and creating lines along the edges to define them. We'll give the back just a little bit more line work before moving on to the claws. These won't be anywhere near as segmented as the main body plating, but we'll make sure each joint of the claws cut away into its own pieces, drawing in lines around the edges of the joints and exaggerating the layers of shell that protrude over them. The antennae are incredibly smooth right now, reading more like tentacles, and I want this to be a hard chitinous growth, with maybe just a little bit of give. There's a soft bit of tissue just before the joints near the face where the antenna connects, and we'll draw some edges around there and further in at the second set of antenna joints, using a smoother brush to draw some folds and wrinkling in between, further denoting that this is in fact soft tissue. With that done, we'll go up the length of the antenna with a brush, drawing in the grain of the shell going up its length. It's still a bit too smooth though, and these lobster type antennae usually come with a lot of spikes. I'm not going to go overboard here, but we can pull out these spikes along the antenna to create a thorny appearance. Finally, we'll use our tried and true bumpiness brush over the length of the antenna, giving it that classic hard shell bumpiness you see on these rougher looking crustaceans. The tail doesn't see much new work. We're coming at it with our bumpiness brush and adding that surface detail along the length of the upper facing tail plates. Only these harder upper shell portions are really getting the bumpiness here, and the underneath shall remain relatively smooth. Instead, the undershell will receive some more segmentation, with smaller segments to the side near the edges of the back plates, and some flowing through the middle up to the underside of the thorax. We'll also inflate the back shell plates just a little bit to close up the gaps in between them, and add some spiking to their edges and along the middle of the back so they aren't too smooth. The back tail fin is also a bit smooth, and I wanted to add some bumpiness to its ends to give it more of a fin-like appearance, as well as some subtle line work to make it so it isn't too perfectly smooth. We'll keep it consistent by adding the same spikes to the main thorax backplate, with some of them coming along the back of the shell to overlay over the tail ever so slightly. While the top of the shell still has the bumpiness texture to give it some roughness, the underside is still too smooth. So we're going over it with the same idea, except rather than the bumpiness brush, we're using a smaller, finer one that won't overtake the surface as much, but instead gives it a subtle crust that still sells the idea that this is a hard surface. With another look over on the body, we'll throw in a forward-facing spike on the front of the head, like a lot of crawfish have. After that, it looks like the sculpting process has finally reached its apex. So what's next? These high polygon sculpts are far too dense in geometry to be able to realistically use for anything animation related. It'd lag way too much. So instead, we're going to undertake the process of retopology. This task involves recreating our entire model, but at a lower amount of faces. This is much more optimized, and if you're thinking we'll lose all the detail we've made so far, we'll be keeping the main shapes of the model, but the finer sculpting details like the bumpiness and lines and whatnot will be carried over in our textures by imprinting the sculpt detail over the textures on our retopologized model. That being said, we'll need to do the retopology first. Naturally, the shark gets first go of it. It's good to see our toothy sea beast again. The process of recreating our model begins with the creation of a simple flat plane. That's face number 1, and we've got a long way to go with these. Admittedly, this is probably one of the more boring and tedious processes of creating an optimized model, and this process exists for pretty much any production-ready model. But we're going over the whole model, face by face, and manually covering the whole sculpt in these faces with a much wider distribution than the faces on the sculpt, but also being careful to contour these faces around important detail areas like the face, gills, and the major shapes of the body like the fins and stuff. I'm not going to explain the whole process in a play-by-play, just because I think the whole thing kind of becomes a bit self-explanatory once you see how it starts. That goes for the crustacean too. Both processes are almost identical in technique. So rather than sitting you through it for like the multiple hour process it took to do both, we're going to speed past it in the form of montage. Thank God that's done. It's one of the more annoying parts of the modeling process, and it can lend itself to some problems if you end up not aligning your faces properly, so that when they eventually meet up, they don't have a matching amount of faces or edges to connect it to. But nonetheless, no point in reminiscing on it. We've got work to do. We'll want to jump into the texturing process here, but first we'll need to UV map our models. A UV map is the distribution of the model's surface over a flat texture space, and to create the lines that mark the edges of that surface, we'll use these red lines called seams. This is where the UV map unwraps itself over the texture, and we'll try to mark these seams in places that'll divide up the model evenly. We want parts like the shark's fins or the crustacean's claws, legs, and antenna to be cut off from the rest of the body in the textures, since they can reduce the texture quality if it's all connected together, since they can't be packed as tightly together in the texture, which reduces the amount of usable space for texturing. So that's our process, adding in seams and unwrapping every single part of the model into the UV space and packing them all together as tightly as possible, assigning a single material for each model, which will be shared among all its parts. When the UV mapping is all done and dusted, it's safe to say we can finally jump into the texturing process. Looking at our texturing setup here, we've used a process called baking that lets us select our higher polygon sculpt model as our target, and since the lower polygon retopologized model is pretty close in shape to that sculpt model, we can use the baking function to imprint the details from that sculpt onto the textures of our new model. These are stored in special textures that affect the way lighting hits our model, creating the illusion of higher detail. We're starting with the shark here, and to begin, we're placing in all the base colors. I want the crustacean to have fairly warm colors, while the shark has cooler ones, so we're starting off with a bluish base. The main body color will also get a metallic sheen to it. While sharks aren't straight up hard metal, the surface of many fish are covered in a substance known as guanine that gives them their metallic sheens. Shark skin is a lot rougher though, so this effect will be much more diminished here. The eyes get a purple base, but we'll draw over it with a white base so the purple only reaches the edges, creating a shadowed look. We'll use the darker purple color to cover the gums and hard plate helmet on the shark's face. These colors are going to change a bit as we go on, but for now we're just trying to get the paint layers in for each color. We'll add some subtle purpling on the upper side muscles as well as some hard purple coloring on the smaller fish fins on the top. For the underside, we're using a third color, white. This will take up the underside of the shark, and the reason for this color variation is actually that sharks can use their darker topsides to camouflage from the deep sea when viewed from above, and the white camouflage from the sunlight above when viewed from below. This covers the underside of the belly, the fins, and the general jaw area. We'll also go over the edges to make it less faded and more splotchy using a tiny dirt brush. We're changing some of the purpling on the body and helmet to a lighter lavender hue, but keeping the same dark maroon on the gums and some other places. The eyes will get a little bit of veins and impurity to make it look more organic and frankly a little zombie-like with the white and pupilless eyes. Around said eyes, we're also drawing in some of that base blue. Since the bony plates are akin to a helmet, the eyes don't sit in the helmet itself, and that means we'll draw some fleshy parts around them to define squishier parts that aren't as part of those plates themselves. The teeth are white at its base, but we'll use one of the textures we got from baking the sculpt details earlier, known as the thickness texture. This, quite literally, defines what parts of the model are thicker or thinner using white and black respectively. We can use that texture as a mask for purple coloring on the teeth and pull it back so that the teeth have darker colors closer to the roots and at their tips, blending them in more with the mouth and giving them a bit of color. It's at this point that we'll also use some other textures we got from baking. These are ones that aren't visible by default, but are instead used for other processes like smart materials that use these textures for automatic placement of details. We're overlaying two of these over our texture. The ambient occlusion, which should provide some subtle shadowing on our model, and the curvature texture, that defines what parts of the model have harsher or smoother angles, represented by white and black. The ambient occlusion we're taking for the shadowing itself, and the curvature we're softly overlaying to further exaggerate the details in the skin, being careful not to overdo it and deep fry our shark. Side note, beer-battered shark, genuinely unbeatable. The ambient occlusion isn't a magic bullet for shadowing, and we still don't have much depth in the gills, so for that we're creating a new black layer and manually drawing in the shading there, fading it out as necessary to make it look believable. If you remember during sculpting, we actually added some scratches and stuff around the model where there would be wounds and scratches. We can use a metallic red color masked to the curvature texture so it only affects deeper lines, and then put that in a folder that itself has a mask so we can draw only where the cuts are. It still needs to be fixed up a little where the bleeding, bleeds over, but overall I'm pleasantly surprised that doing this way worked at all. The surface still does look a little bit too artificial though. So I'm creating a new darker layer and placing something known as a smart mask over it. This is like the smart materials I mentioned earlier, using the textures created from our baking process to decide where to place details. In this case, the smart mask we're using is for surface wear, and we can place it over our model and fade away any parts that look a little overdone, especially on the underside, since the wear cuts through the white a lot more than the other colors. The only thing we'll do for this texture is add a subtle striped pattern along the side that doesn't quite translate visually, but at least gives the side some color variation, and ironically, we're going to pull the colors of the whole thing back by making a master color layer that'll subtly tint the whole thing to a bluish purple hue. That way all the colors are brought closer on the color wheel and they become a little bit more harmonious. I'm feeling pretty good about this, and I think it's time we square away the shark for now and pull out our next lucky candidate. It's crustacean time! Just like our shark, our crustacean has the details from its original sculpt baked onto the newer retopologized version of the model, so now we can work on it as if it were the sculpted version with only some minor differences. The original base color we're starting off with is a sort of sun-baked orange, paired with a black color. I end up changing these soon, but we're putting the orange over the harder parts of the shell, with the black color taking up the softer portions like the joints in the antenna and the underside of the shell in general. We'll change the black to white and use those baked textures we got to actually draw in some darkness onto the bumps of the shell. You see, while we can also use the curvature texture to pull in some overall detail, we can also use it as a mask to paint onto the bumpiness, since those bumps are counted as harsh curves. Thus, we can paint over the tops of the shell with it, and it'll only really affect the bumps. This gives us some color variation and really sells the hardness of these bumps. It'll get a bit heavier on places like the spikes on the claw and the bottom claws of the legs, but overall it's pretty consistent. For the underside, we're doing a similar thing, but rather than just a black color, we're overlaying it with a yellow tinge, and just for that splash of variation, we're also covering some of the spikes on the hard shell with this yellow. At the moment, that's on the sides of the back plate, and the sides and front of the head shell. The underside of lobsters also seems to have this weird winding, veiny pattern, and I also wanted to implement that here. It's a bit of a band-aid solution, but I used a simple pattern and masked it onto the underside to achieve the effect. We'll add in a black color layer to go over the eyes, since our ambient occlusion texture, which handles subtle shadowing, won't make an effect on this part of the texture. However, I want some darkness on the outside of the eyes, both to exaggerate them more as well as give them more of a dark brooding look. The eyes themselves are a similar process to the shark, giving them a dark base that's followed up with a lighter yellow tinge faded into the middle. Crustaceans also have compact eyes. They're not as super visible to the naked eye, but we can make an exception here for stylistic choice. Using a grid texture, we can pair it with a height channel and apply it over the eyes to create the bumpiness of a compound eye. Looking at the crustacean as a whole, the colors are just a little too uniform, so we're overlaying the red using a browner color that'll use the same wear smart mask that we used on the shark. This one will be blended in mostly over the harder shell, but also a little bit everywhere else, less so on the eyes and tail fins. Speaking of adjusting the colors, we're also going to go ahead and add in a master color layer. Usually I do this later on, but I wanted to get an idea of where we're going with this. It's set to a redder tinge and brings in all the colors only a little bit closer. Usually crustaceans like this are only really this red when they get boiled, but again, it's a stylistic choice. Using the same method we used to add the black spots on the shell, we're also adding in a yellow version that'll go mainly along the spikes of the shell, claws, legs, and antenna, further defining them while also giving the overall design a bit more for the eye to drift to. It also helps that these spikes generally line the edges of the model, letting them define the silhouette at a distance. I didn't sculpt any wounds in specifically, however I still wanted the appearance of some damage, so rather than working into pre-sculpted depth, I'm going to create a new red metallic layer with some deepened height on its channel, which we can draw over the model using a conveniently provided brush for scratches. We can also rim this with a lighter hue to emulate scarring or cracked shell. I still think the colors overall could use a touch, so we're also layering in a faded yellow texture over the model that works off of a gradient, meaning it'll fade in from underneath, which should help transition the colors better as well as more closely matching up with the yellowing on the shell. For the top and bottom shelling, I still think it needs a little bit more surface detail, and to do so I'm using two procedural textures with some height and masking them to each section respectively. The hard top shell will get a somewhat cracked looking rocky texture, while the underside gets a texture somewhat comparable to brushed concrete. We're going to take a quick look over it to fix up some of the fading on some parts of the colors and then add in a little bit more yellow on the claws. It's now that we'll cash in on the curvature texture that we got from baking way earlier, but rather than using it to draw on any surface colors, we're doing what we did with the shark, overlaying it subtly to pull in any details we got from the sculpt and making it look overall a little bit sharper. I'm also adding a bit of a metallic shine to the hard shell. Crustaceans don't really have this feature as far as I know, but since this is my design, I'm doing it and explaining it away as being composed of very mineral-rich chitin. Heck, maybe it's valuable. There you go, there's some lore. Looking at it now, I actually think we went a little too easy on the black spots that litter the shell. So we're going back to draw it in more, adding more density to the spots all around the shell and taking advantage of the black color layer here too to tip the tail fins with it and then fade it out a little bit. We're also going to add a small shadowed line to the segmentation in the front of the head just under the antenna to act as a small crustacean mouth. Once again, we're adding an overarching color layer. This time it's yellow using a curvature texture mask, but rather than affecting the bumpier parts, we'll invert it to affect the smoother parts. This really pulls out all the details, having the black spots contrast the yellow smooth areas with classic red fading in between. I did play around with some pupils for the crustacean, but honestly I think it works better without them. No pupils takes away its humanity a bit and makes it look more monster-like. Not to mention it complements the shark and its equally vacant stare. On the tail, it still looks a little too smooth, and while these are plates that don't really have any kind of corrugated detail, if this guy's built for swimming in the open seas, then it's only fair that the tail fins might be a little more hydrodynamic. So we're drawing in some height lines across this area and fading them out, giving off the impression of fibrous fins. We're, once again, going over with some yellowing. It's the same one we did earlier for curvature, but I'm painting some on the legs too. Looking over what we got, I think I'm pretty happy with the result. Admittedly, this thing doesn't derive too far from real-world lobsters and crawfish, but I think it looks cool, and there's only one step left. Rigging. That's the process of creating a skeleton for a model and assigning parts of the model to move with the bones. We don't really have a pre-packed skeleton to create for the crustacean. Admittedly, there is actually one in the Blender rigging add-on I used that I think has a shark in there, but I don't really want to use that one. So, we're creating our own skeletons for this. It's actually pretty straightforward, so let's take a look at our shark. We're pulling out these sticks, which are our bones in this case, and creating new ones to align with the parts of the model that we want to move. This is stuff like spine bones, as well as the bones leading into the tail, the bones for the fins, and one for the jaw. Once they're all aligned, we can assign the model we made to that skeleton, which will create a series of groups called vertex groups for each corresponding bone. We can assign faces of our model to each vertex group and blend them as necessary, which should make the assigned faces of that vertex group move with the bone of the same name. From here, we can work away at the process until all of the bones are done. The crustacean faces just about the same process, if not an easier one, considering some parts of the model that we need to select to assign to bones are already pre-separated given its segmented nature. But nonetheless, we're creating a skeleton for the crustacean and assigning the vertex groups as needed until both sea creatures are capable of movement. They move. They live! I've also added something called damped tracking to some of the tailbones of the shark and the crustacean, as well as its antenna, which will cause these bones to follow the assigned one with a slight delay. If we assign these tracks in a chain, we have something that looks like simple jiggle physics, or wiggle physics I suppose. Either way, they are ready for combat. I mean, we can really get started here. Submarine! I need you to release the scene locks, we're doing it!
Releasing scene locks. Warning. Contained objects far exceed safety limits. Are you sure whatever you're doing is worth it?
Oh, alright. This is it, gang. We've done it. 2 sea monsters. Once they catch a whiff of each other, they'll assert their dominance.
Razorhelm Dread Shredder versus Cragforge Boulder Claw.
That can't be good.
Big fat I told you so.
Oh. Huh. You know what? Things could be worse. Oh! Oh, hey, we're back. Okay, let's bail. Come on, get us out of here. Hey, are you there?
Sorry, I was my minesweeper.
What? Go!
Namby-pamby.
Whoa, that was intense. You all in one piece? I'm exhausted. But hey, we got there. Thanks for sticking by. I think I finally got my sea monster kick out of my system. At least for now. If this is the kind of format you like, and you want to be there for the next one, you could consider subscribing or otherwise just give it a little like. If you have anything you'd like to see, let me know down below. That's all I have for you today, but hopefully you were thoroughly entertained. Otherwise, let me know where I can improve. 3D art can get really monotonous, so I try my best to make it as watchable as possible, and hopefully I at least achieved some of that with this project. With that said, I just want to say, thanks again, everyone.